video is focused on the concept of accruals and prepayments. This video is very relevant for students pursuing different qualifications. If I start from the lowest, like O levels and A levels, ACCA F3, F9, CMA, CA, CPA, CIA. So this topic is very important. Now, in order to understand the concept of accruals and prepayments, we need to understand the matching principle. The matching principle says that in order to arrive at the correct profit and loss, we have to consider only the expenses, income and cost of a particular period. That means matching cost with revenues. So if we don't consider the relevant cost and expenses and income for the particular period, finally we will arrive at an incorrect profit or loss. So in order to understand accruals and prepayments, you also need to understand the rules of debit and credit, the normal balances of our asset, the normal balances of the different heads of accounts like asset, liability, capital, income, cost and expenses. So let me give you in a nutshell. The normal balances always deals with increases. For example, increase in asset are recorded as a debit. So the normal balance of all the assets will be debit, the opening balance of all the assets will be debit, and the closing balance of all the assets will be credit. Likewise, increase in liability is recorded as a credit. So normal balance of all liabilities will be a credit. Opening balance of all the liabilities will be a credit, but the closing balance of all the liabilities will be recorded as a debit. So please make note of it. Let's begin with accruals and prepayments. Here I've given you example of rental income. We receive rent. So can we have an accrual or prepayment? Let's have a look at it. In this, what is happening here, we are talking about rental income of 20,000 and rent received so far is 18. So if I make a T account here for rent, always remember when we receive rent, the entry is cash debit, rental income credit. So all rent received will be recorded on the credit side, which is 18,000. Not forgetting the annual rent is 20,000. So the rent for the year is 20. We have only received 18. That means there is an accrual, there is a receivable of rent at year end. 20,000 is the annual rent. We have only received 18. That means another 2,000 we have to receive at year end. What we have to receive at year end is an accrual of income. In other words, you can call it rent receivable. Now, rent receivable is an asset. Closing balance of assets are always recorded at the credit side. So I can write here, carried down, rent receivable, 2,000. So when I add this, I get 20, and this 20 would go in the profit and loss account as an income. Always remember, the word accrue means due. Now we need to understand, do we receive rent or do we pay rent? If we receive rent and there is an accrual, that means we have to receive. If we pay rent and if there is an accrual, that means we have to pay. So here accrual of rent or rent receivable means we still have to receive, which is an asset for us. The example continues in the next year 2020. What is happening here is, I'm continuing the T account here. This is for the rent. We already had 2,000 receivables. So all receivables are assets. Opening balance brought down is opening balance of receivable. Accrued rent is 2,000. How much rent has been received this year? 17. Whenever we receive rent, the entry is cash debit, rental income credit. So I'm crediting rental income by 17,000. Now, common sense. Now, what is the common sense? Already we have a receivable of rent, which we did not receive enough last year. It was 20, we received only 18. So there is already an opening balance of rent 2,000. Rent for current year is 20. So 2,000 is still receivable from last year, 20,000 for this year. Total 22,000 rent we have to receive, but we have received only 17. So how much is still to be received? 22 minus 17. So at year end in 2020, we still have a receivable, rent accrued, due rent, receivable rent of 5,000. So rent receivable is an asset. Closing balance of an asset is recorded here. Carried down, receivable, 5,000. When you add these two, you get 22,000. minus this, the balancing figure will go in the profit and loss as rental income. So if I make my financial statements at the end of year 2020, this 20,000 will go as an income, rental income, and this receivable of rent 5,000 will go in the asset among the current assets as rent receivable 5,000. Example continues here. Next year, what is happening? This receivable will come here as an opening balance, brought down. All assets have an opening balance of debit. Rent receivable debit, how much? 5,000. So opening balance, we have 5,000 of rent receivable. And how much rent we have received this year? 28,000. So cash here, 28,000. Now again, common sense. 5,000 we have to receive from previous year. This year rent is 20. So 20 plus 5 should be 25,000. So we should be ideally receiving 25. But the customers paid us 28. So the rent we should be receiving is 25. But the customer has paid 28. That means 3,000 we have received in advance. And what we receive in advance is known as unearned, and that's a liability. So instead of receiving 25, means 20,000 current year and 5,000 previous year, instead of receiving 25, we are receiving 28. 3,000 we are receiving in advance. It's a liability, and closing balance of a liability is always recorded on the debit side. So I can write here, carried down, unearned rent. Unearned rent is a liability, which is 3,000. So 28,000 minus 8 will give me a figure which goes into profit and loss, which is 20,000 rent for the year. Then comes 2022. Same example continues. I'm making a T account for rent. I have unearned rent. Unearned rent is a liability. So opening balance of a liability will always be on the credit side. So I can write here, brought down unearned rent, this 3,000, which is coming here. How much rent is received here? 12,000. When we receive rent, the entry is cash debit, rental income credit. So I'm putting this here as 12,000 rental income credit received in cash. Now, 3,000 of rent for this year has already been received previous year. So for this year, we already have 3,000 rent. 12,000 is received further. So for this year, how much rent has been received? For this year, 3,000 we received in the previous year and 12,000 we received this year. So total rent collected so far is 15. But the rent for the year is actually 20. So how much we still have to receive? 5,000. And we still have to receive at year end. That means it's a receivable, it's an asset. Closing balance of an asset is always recorded on the credit side, carried down of receivable, which is 5,000. You add all these, you get 20. And this will go into the profit and loss as an income for the year, 20,000. Finally, year 2023, the example continues. We have a receivable closing balance. It's an asset. It will come on the debit side, brought down 5,000, which was receivable. Receivable is an asset or accrued rent, you can call it. We have to receive. How much we received this year? 30. So all receipts will come on the credit side. Cash debit, rent credit. That's why I'm putting it on the credit side. Now again, we have to be careful. 5,000 we had to receive rent from the previous year, which was not received. 20,000 is the rent for the current year. So 5,000 from previous and 20,000 this year makes 25. How much rent we are receiving? 30. That means instead of 25, we are receiving 30, which means we are receiving in advance. What is received in advance is an unearned rent, which is a current liability. So closing balance of a current liability is recorded on the debit side, carried down unearned rent, which is 5,000. So from 30,000, when I minus 10, the amount goes into the profit and loss for rent of the year is 20,000. So, lesson to learn. When we are making a rental income account, I compare this account with a military graveyard. A military graveyard means whether you belong to the Army, Navy or Air Force, when you die, you are buried in the military graveyard. So this T account will have three different types of things. It can have cash received. It can have an unearned rent balance, which is a liability. It can have a rent receivable balance, which is an asset. So in one account, we are having a liability, which is unearned rent. We are having an asset, which is rent receivable. And we are also having cash, which is received. And the balancing figure always goes into the profit and loss, and it has to be in any of these cases. If you look at profit and loss, how much? 20. Profit and loss, how much? 20. Profit and loss, how much? 20. 20 and 20. Which means irrespective of the amount you receive more or less, what goes into the profit and loss is the rent for the accounting period, which is 20,000. Now the next example I'm going to give you about rent, but what if we are paying rent? Here we talked about rent income. Now we are talking about rental expense. So guys, now I'm talking about rent from a different perspective. That is, if we are paying rent, for us rent is an expense. Annual rent is 12,000, means 1,000 per month. But how much has been paid so far? 8,000. So how is it recorded into a T account? This is a T account for rent. Please remember, when we pay rent, the double entry is rent expense debit, cash or bank credit. So I'm assuming that we are paying in cash. So whenever we pay rent expense debit, cash credit, this is the rent account. So all payments will be recorded on the debit side, which is 8,000. We have paid rent 8,000. Now common sense, rent for the year is 12, but we have only paid 8,000 in the year. So how much still we have to pay? 12,000 is the annual rent. We have paid just 8,000 so far. So remaining 4,000 is still to be paid. What is still to be paid is known as rent accrued, due, outstanding, rent payable, and it's a liability. So closing balance of a liability is always recorded on the debit side. So I can write here at year end, I can write balance carried down, accrual. Accrual means I still have to pay how much? 4,000. I add these two, I get 12, and this will be charged into profit and loss as rent for the year. Charged to profit and loss means it will go as an expense in the income statement account. So no matter how much you have paid, what goes into the income statement as an expense is always the annual rent, which is 12,000. The example continues. Next year, 2020, before I record anything, I have to bring the balance down. It's a liability. Closing balance of a liability is on the debit side. Opening will always be on the credit side. So I'm writing here balance brought down of accrual, which is 4,000. How much rent has been paid? When you pay rent, the entry is rent debit. So all payments will be recorded here, which is 15,000. Now, common sense. 4,000 was still due for the rent for last year. This year's rent is 12, and 12 and 4 makes how much? 16,000. How much we have paid? Only 15. That means still 1,000 is due, is payable at the year end. So closing balance of a liability, we have 1,000 closing liability will be written on the debit side. Balance carried down, accrual, 1,000. So when you add this, you will get 16 here. 16 minus this, the balancing figure will go in the profit and loss account as rent for the year, which is an expense. The example continues. Remember, we have an accrual, opening liability. Opening liability will come on the credit side. Balance carried, brought down. Brought down means opening balance. How much? Accrual. How much? 1,000. How much has been paid? When you pay, you record here. 20,000 has been paid. Now, if we do a small analysis, opening liability for rent was 1,000. means this 1000 was not paid for the last year. So 1000 is yet to be paid. The current year's rent is 12. So 12,000 of current year, 1000 of previous year. So total how much rent we were supposed to pay? 13,000. 1000 from previous year and 12,000 for this year. 13. But how much was paid? 20. That means instead of paying 13,000, we have paid 20. 7,000 we have paid in advance. We call it prepayment or prepaid rent. Prepaid rent is an asset. So at year end, we have a closing balance of asset. Closing balance of assets are recorded on the credit side. I can write balance carried down. I have a prepaid here of 7,000. So this 20 minus these two will give me the amount which should be charged into profit and loss as rent expense for the year, which is 12,000. So in 2021, if I prepare my financial statements, what's happening? 12,000 will go into the income statement, into the profit and loss, into the statement of comprehensive income as an expense for the year. This 7,000, because it's prepaid, it will go in the assets, to be more precise, among the current assets as prepaid rent. Example still continues. We are moving to 2022. Now we had a closing prepayment of 7,000. Prepayment is an asset. Closing balance of this year will be the opening balance for the next year. So here I am taking it as balance brought down, prepayment. Opening balance of assets are always recorded on the debit side, which is 7,000. How much has been paid? 8,000. All payments will be recorded on the debit side for expenses. Now when I add these, this is 15. What does this mean for the current year? For the current year, previous year we have already paid 7,000 rent, which was prepaid, paid in advance. So last year we paid in advance 7,000 for this year. And for this year we have already paid 8,000. So 7,000 already paid in last year for the current year, 8,000 paid for the current year in the current year. So total how much rent has been paid for the current year, which is 15. And what is the rent for the current year in reality? It's only 12. The annual rent is 12. So if we have paid 15, which means 3,000 has been paid in advance. So at year end, our prepaid rent, closing balance of a prepaid, which is an asset, is 3,000. So 15 minus 3, charge to profit and loss will be 12,000, which is annual rent, which pertains to this particular year. At this stage, if I prepare my financial statements, 12,000 will go in the statement of comprehensive income as an expense, and this prepayment carried down, closing balance of prepayment is a current asset, will go among current asset as prepaid rent. Finally, in 2023, the account continues. We have a closing prepaid, so it will come on the debit side. Balance brought down, prepayment, 3,000. How much has been paid? 5,000. So all payments to be recorded on the debit side. Now, for 2023, 3,000 was already paid in the previous year, which is 2022. So 3,000 was already paid. 5,000 is paid this year. Total is 8,000. But what is the rent for the year? 12. If rent for the year is 12, but only 8,000 has been paid so far, so remaining 4 is yet to be paid, which is a liability. So closing balance of a liability is always recorded on the debit side. So I write balance carried down, accrual. How much? 4,000. 8 minus 12. When I add all these, I get 12,000. And this 12,000 will go in the profit and loss as an expense for the year. So guys, you need to understand, when we're talking about accruals and prepayments, number one, you need to know the rules of debit and credit. Number two, you need to know the normal balances. Number three, you need to know the opening balances of assets and liabilities. Where do we record it? On the debit side or credit side? You need to know the closing balance of assets and liabilities. Then, if we are paying rents, all the payments should be recorded on the debit side. But if you are receiving rent, it should be recorded on the credit side. If you have not seen my videos on basic accounting, I strongly recommend that you watch those. That will improve your understanding of rules of debit and credit, opening and closing balances. If you have any queries relating to accruals and prepayment, leave a query in the comment section and I will respond to you as usual. If you are not yet subscribed to my channel, please subscribe to my channel. Press the bell notification button so that you get my videos on a timely basis. If you like this video, please share it with your dear and near ones so that others can also benefit. Thank you so very much for your precious time.